There was a time when one name quietly shaped kitchens across America: Betty Crocker. Her recipes weren't just instructions, they were trusted companions, passed from one generation to the next. But somewhere along the way, many of those dishes vanished. Tucked away in aging cookbooks, forgotten in handwritten notes, or left behind as trends changed. Today, we're opening that door again. These aren't just recipes, they're stories of comfort, survival, and family tables long gone. And by the end of this video, you might just rediscover a dish that feels like it was waiting for you all along. Long before modern kitchens were filled with shortcuts and ready-made meals, there was a simple dish that quietly earned its place on American dinner tables: Betty Crocker's forgotten creamed chipped beef on toast. To some, it was just a quick meal. But to others, it carried the weight of an entire era. This recipe rose to popularity during the years surrounding the Great Depression and World War II, when families had to stretch every ingredient as far as it could go. Dried beef, preserved with salt, became a pantry staple because it lasted longer than fresh cuts. Paired with a basic white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, it transformed into something warm, filling, and surprisingly comforting. In small kitchens across the country, this dish would simmer gently on stovetops while children waited at worn wooden tables. The smell alone was enough to signal that dinner, no matter how simple, was ready. Toasted bread served as the base, soaking up the creamy sauce, ensuring nothing went to waste. Every bite told a quiet story of resilience. But over time, as fresh ingredients became easier to find and culinary tastes evolved, this humble meal slowly disappeared. It became something people remembered, but rarely recreated. Even its nickname, once commonly spoken, faded into the background of history. Yet, there's something deeply human about a recipe like this. It reminds us that food isn't always about luxury, it's about survival, creativity, and finding comfort in the smallest things. And perhaps that's why dishes like this deserve to be remembered, not just for how they tasted, but for what they meant in the lives of those who made them. There was a dessert that once felt like pure magic on a plate: Betty Crocker's impossible pie. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. A simple mixture poured into a dish, nothing layered, nothing complicated. But as it baked, something strange happened. Without any careful assembly, the ingredients separated on their own, forming a soft crust at the bottom, a creamy center, and a lightly golden top. For many home cooks, it felt almost unbelievable. This recipe gained popularity in the 1950s and 1960s, a time when convenience began reshaping American kitchens. Busy households wanted meals that were quick but still comforting, and this pie delivered both. With pantry staples like eggs, milk, sugar, and baking mix, it required little effort but produced something that looked and tasted far more complex. In quiet suburban homes, this dessert often appeared after long days, served slightly warm or chilled from the refrigerator. Families would gather, cutting into the pie with curiosity, watching the layers reveal themselves with each slice. It wasn't just about sweetness, it was about that small moment of surprise, the feeling that something simple could still feel special. But as baking trends became more elaborate, filled with intricate decorations and bold flavors, recipes like impossible pie began to fade. It no longer matched the modern idea of what a dessert should be. Slowly, it disappeared from tables, replaced by more visually striking creations. Still, there's something quietly fascinating about it. A recipe that required no precision in layering, yet created perfection on its own. It stands as a reminder of a time when simplicity carried its own kind of wonder, and when a humble pie could still feel like a small miracle. There was once a salad that didn't look like a salad at all, yet it held a permanent place at family gatherings and holiday tables. Betty Crocker's frosted ribbon loaf was as much a centerpiece as it was a dish, layered in soft pastel colors and coated in a smooth, creamy frosting. To modern eyes, it might seem unusual, even puzzling. But in its time, it represented creativity, effort, and a sense of pride. This recipe became popular during the 1950s, when presentation began to matter just as much as taste. Home cooks weren't just feeding their families, they were showcasing their skills. The ribbon loaf was carefully built in layers, each one tinted with subtle colors and filled with savory ingredients like chicken, ham, or vegetables blended into creamy spreads. Once chilled and set, it was sliced to reveal its striped interior, each layer perfectly defined. In living rooms filled with conversation and laughter, this dish often sat at the center of the table, drawing attention before anyone even took a bite. Guests would admire it first, sometimes hesitating, unsure of what to expect. But once served, it offered a surprising balance of flavors, rich, smooth, and delicately seasoned. Over time, however, tastes began to shift. Brightly colored, molded dishes lost their appeal, and simpler, fresher presentations took their place. The ribbon loaf, once admired for its uniqueness, slowly disappeared from recipe boxes and memory. Yet it remains a quiet symbol of an era when food was also art. It reminds us of a time when effort was layered into every dish, and when even something as unexpected as a frosted loaf could bring people together, if only for a moment around the table. There was a time when even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something that felt indulgent. One such creation was Betty Crocker's tomato soup spice cake, a dessert that quietly blurred the line between necessity and invention. At first mention, it sounded strange. Tomato soup in a cake? Yet for those who lived through its time, it made perfect sense. This recipe emerged during periods when stretching pantry staples was not just practical, but essential. Canned tomato soup, already common in many households, added moisture, subtle sweetness, and a rich color to the batter. Combined with flour, sugar, and warm spices like cinnamon and cloves, it created a cake that was soft, fragrant, and unexpectedly comforting. In modest kitchens, this cake often baked slowly in the oven, filling the home with a scent that felt far richer than the ingredients suggested. It would be served plain or topped with a simple frosting, sliced carefully and shared among family members who understood the value of making something out of very little. Each bite carried warmth, not just from the spices, but from the quiet ingenuity behind it. As years passed, the idea of using soup in dessert began to feel outdated, even odd. With access to more refined ingredients, recipes like this were set aside, remembered only by those who had once relied on them. But there's something deeply compelling about it. A cake born not from luxury, but from creativity under constraint. It stands as a reminder that some of the most memorable flavors don't come from abundance, but from the ability to see possibility where others might not. There was once a dish that turned leftovers into something almost unrecognizable: Betty Crocker's ham and banana hollandaise. At first, it sounds like a mistake. Sweet fruit paired with savory meat, all covered in a rich, buttery sauce. But in the kitchens of the 1950s and 1960s, this combination was seen as bold, even sophisticated. This recipe emerged during a time when American cooking began experimenting with contrast. Convenience foods were becoming more common, and home cooks were encouraged to try new, unexpected pairings. Canned or preserved ingredients made it easier to create dishes that felt exotic without requiring rare items. Bananas, once considered somewhat novel, were now widely available and often used in ways that might seem unusual today. The preparation itself was simple but deliberate. Bananas were wrapped in slices of ham, then warmed until the flavors softened into each other. Over the top, a smooth hollandaise sauce was poured, rich with butter and egg yolks, adding a velvety finish. The result was a dish that balanced sweetness, saltiness, and creaminess in every bite. Served at dinner parties or special family meals, it often sparked conversation before the first forkful was even taken. Some were intrigued, others hesitant, but it rarely went unnoticed. It was a reflection of a time when trying something new in the kitchen carried a sense of excitement. Eventually, however, tastes began to favor simpler, more familiar combinations. Dishes like this slowly disappeared, leaving behind only curiosity and memory. Still, It stands as a reminder that food has always been about exploration. Even the most unexpected pairings can tell a story, one of risk, creativity, and a willingness to step beyond what feels comfortable. There was a time when salads were not bound by greens or even freshness as we understand it today. One such creation was Betty Crocker's Perfection Salad, a shimmering, carefully molded dish that looked almost too precise to eat. Suspended within clear gelatin were slices of cabbage, carrots, and sometimes olives, arranged as if frozen in time. This recipe gained recognition in the early 20th century and carried its popularity into mid-century kitchens. Gelatin-based dishes were seen as modern, even elegant. They represented control, patience, and a certain level of skill. Preparing it required careful timing, dissolving the gelatin, cooling it just enough, then adding vegetables at the perfect moment so they would remain evenly suspended rather than sinking or floating. In quiet dining rooms, this salad often appeared as a side dish during special meals. Its glossy surface would catch the light, drawing attention before anything else on the table. When sliced, it held its shape perfectly, each piece revealing a cross-section of ingredients that seemed almost decorative. For families of that era, it wasn't just about taste. It was about presentation and the quiet satisfaction of creating something visually striking from simple components. The texture, slightly firm yet delicate, added to its uniqueness, offering a contrast to the softer dishes around it. As decades passed, however, the appeal of gelatin salads faded. Fresh, crisp vegetables and simpler preparations took their place. The idea of vegetables set in gelatin began to feel distant, even unfamiliar. Yet, Perfection Salad remains a fascinating reminder of how food trends evolve. It captures a moment when innovation looked very different, and when something as simple as a molded dish could represent progress, precision, and a touch of artistry in everyday cooking. There was a time when desserts didn't need to be extravagant to feel special. One such treat was Betty Crocker's brown sugar refrigerator cookies, a simple creation that quietly became a staple in many American homes. They weren't flashy or decorated, but they carried something far more lasting: anticipation. The idea behind these cookies was as practical as it was comforting. The dough was prepared ahead of time, shaped into a log, and stored in the refrigerator. Whenever a sweet craving appeared, slices could be cut and baked fresh, filling the kitchen with a warm, familiar aroma. It was a dessert that waited patiently, ready whenever it was needed. During the 1940s and 1950s, this method fit perfectly into everyday life. Families were busy, resources were carefully managed, and recipes that offered both convenience and comfort were treasured. Brown sugar, with its deep, molasses-like flavor, gave these cookies a richness that felt far more indulgent than their simple ingredients suggested. In many homes, children would watch closely as the dough was sliced into perfect rounds, each piece placed carefully on a baking sheet. The oven door would close, and within minutes, the scent would begin to spread, soft, sweet, and impossible to ignore. It was more than just baking. It was a moment that brought people together. Over time, however, prepackaged cookie dough and store-bought options replaced this slow, intentional process. The ritual of preparing and waiting began to fade. But there's something enduring about these cookies. They remind us that not every treat needs to be immediate. Sometimes, the quiet act of waiting, and the promise of something warm just ahead, is what makes it truly memorable. There was a breakfast that carried both practicality and comfort, quietly making its mark in American kitchens: Betty Crocker's baked oatmeal squares. Unlike the fluffy, individual portions we often see today, this dish was made in a single pan, baked slowly, then cut into squares to serve the whole family. It was wholesome, filling, and carried a subtle sweetness that made mornings feel a little brighter. Emerging during the 1940s and 1950s, this recipe reflected the era's focus on economy and nourishment. Oats were inexpensive, widely available, and packed with energy, perfect for children heading to school or adults preparing for long workdays. Mixed with milk, eggs, a touch of sugar, and occasionally fruit or nuts, The baked oatmeal transformed into a hearty dish that could be eaten warm or cold, giving families flexibility without sacrificing taste. In many homes, this recipe became part of the morning ritual. The pan would come out of the oven, releasing the comforting aroma of toasted oats and butter. Families would gather around, slicing generous squares that could be enjoyed immediately or packed for lunchboxes. It wasn't just breakfast, it was a quietly unifying moment, giving structure and warmth to the start of the day. Over the decades, however, quick-cooking cereals and prepackaged options began to dominate the breakfast table. Recipes like baked oatmeal squares gradually receded, preserved only in memory and tattered cookbooks. Yet its charm remains undeniable. It represents a time when food was simple but intentional, practical yet comforting. Even today, recreating it can bring back a feeling of home, nostalgia, and a slower, gentler rhythm to the morning, one square at a time. There was a snack that captured the imagination of children and adults alike: Betty Crocker's cheese swirl bread. Unlike the plain loaves that filled most pantries, this recipe combined soft, yeasted dough with ribbons of cheese folded throughout, creating a visual and flavorful surprise in every slice. It wasn't just bread, it was a quiet celebration of texture, taste, and patience. This creation gained traction in the 1950s, when home baking was a common pastime and families sought ways to make everyday ingredients feel special. Cheese, often used sparingly, became the star here, infused into the dough so that each bite carried both savory richness and a tender crumb. The technique of swirling ensured the flavor wasn't uniform. It teased the taste buds with every slice. In kitchens where the aroma of baking bread already symbolized comfort, the cheese swirl added a layer of anticipation. Children would hover, waiting to see the first slice revealed, its golden crust yielding to soft, cheesy ribbons inside. It was a treat that transformed a simple loaf into an experience. But as packaged breads and quick recipes became more common, labor-intensive creations like this slowly disappeared. The hands-on process, once part of daily life, was replaced by convenience, leaving only memories of a dish that delighted both the eye and the palate. Yet its charm endures. Cheese swirl bread reminds us of a time when patience in the kitchen was rewarded, and when even a humble loaf could carry joy, surprise, and a sense of pride for the one who made it. Recreating it today is not just about baking, it's about reconnecting with an era where flavor and care walked hand in hand. There was a dessert that seemed almost too whimsical to exist: Betty Crocker's pineapple upside-down angel cake. Unlike the denser, heavier versions of the era, this cake was light, airy, and crowned with caramelized pineapple rings and maraschino cherries. It was a spectacle, a showpiece that could turn an ordinary kitchen into a stage for wonder. This recipe became popular in the 1950s and 1960s, a time when American home cooks embraced creativity alongside convenience. Canned pineapple and cherries, both widely available, made it possible to craft a visually stunning dessert without exotic ingredients. The angel food cake base, delicate and feather-light, contrasted beautifully with the sweet, sticky topping, creating a texture and flavor experience that felt both luxurious and accessible. In family kitchens, this cake often marked special occasions. Children would press their noses to the oven door, eager for the golden brown top to emerge, its caramel scent filling the room. It wasn't just dessert, it was celebration, ritual, and nostalgia baked into every airy bite. Over time, as tastes evolved toward simpler or more decadent desserts, recipes like this became rarities, remembered fondly but rarely recreated. The intricate combination of light sponge, sweet fruit, and sticky caramel seemed almost too nostalgic for modern tables. Yet the pineapple upside-down angel cake endures as a reminder of the ingenuity and charm of mid-century American baking. It embodies a time when presentation mattered, when desserts were both treat and showpiece, and when the humble home kitchen could produce moments of delight that lingered long after the last slice disappeared. These 10 recipes are more than just instructions on a page, they're glimpses into kitchens of the past, where creativity, resourcefulness, and a touch of whimsy shaped every meal. From sweet surprises to savory comforts, each dish tells a story of an era when food was about more than taste. It was about family, tradition, and memory. Rediscovering these lost Betty Crocker classics isn't just a culinary adventure. It's a way to reconnect with the flavors, the rituals, and the simple joys that once defined American home cooking. So why not bring one of these recipes back to your table and taste a piece of history for yourself?